The parking lot of the Meadows Mall smelled of hot asphalt and exhaust fumes, the September heat still oppressive even as the sun dipped behind the spring mountains. It was Thursday, September 17th, 1992, and Paula Davis had just finished her evening shift at the Mervyn's department store. At 23 years old, she walked toward her car with her purse slung over her shoulder, completely unaware that she would never make it home. Stephen Davis knew something was wrong by 9:30 that night. His wife Paula was never late, never failed to call if her plans changed, never deviated from the reliable routines that structured their young marriage. They had been married for only 14 months, living in a small apartment on East Tropicana Avenue, and Paula's predictability was something Stephen had come to depend on. She worked the 2 to 8 shift at Mervyn's, selling cosmetics and fragrances to tourists and locals who wandered through the Meadows Mall. Her shift ended at 8, and the drive home took 12 minutes, maybe 15 if she hit traffic on Valley View Boulevard. By 8:30, she was always walking through their apartment door, tired but cheerful, ready to hear about his day managing the stockroom at a sporting goods store downtown. But 8:30 came and went. Then 9. Stephen called the mall, spoke to a security guard who patrolled the parking lot, asked if anyone had seen a young woman with shoulder-length brown hair, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, wearing the burgundy vest that all Mervyn's employees wore over their clothes. The security guard said the store had closed at 8:15, that most employees had cleared out by 8:30. He offered to walk the parking lot, look for Paula's car, a 1987 Honda Civic, powder blue with a dent in the rear bumper, from when she had backed into a shopping cart the previous month. 20 minutes later, the security guard called back. He had found the Civic in the southeast corner of the parking lot, in the employee section where Paula always parked. The car was locked, undisturbed. Through the window, he could see her purse on the passenger seat. Stephen felt his chest tighten as he thanked the guard and hung up. He called the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department at 9:47, his voice steady but strained, explaining that his wife was missing, that her car was still at the mall but she was nowhere to be found. Officers arrived at the Meadows Mall just after 10, their patrol car lights casting blue and red patterns across the mostly empty parking lot. The mall had closed, the remaining vehicles belonging to cleaning crews and late-shift employees from the food court. 2 uniformed officers, both relatively young and uncertain about the seriousness of a missing person report filed less than 2 hours after someone was last seen, approached the Honda Civic with flashlights. They peered through the windows, documenting what they saw. Paula's purse sat upright on the passenger seat, a black leather shoulder bag with a brass clasp. Her keys were not in the ignition. The doors were locked, the windows rolled up completely. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no indication that anyone had attempted to access the vehicle. One of the officers radioed for a supervisor while the other interviewed the security guard who had found the car. The guard, a man in his 50s named Robert Chen, who had worked mall security for 6 years, explained that he had made his regular rounds at 7:45, then again at 8:30. He distinctly remembered seeing the blue Honda during both passes because it was parked in a spot near the edge of the lot, close to where the asphalt met an empty field of desert scrub. The employee parking area was poorly lit compared to the main customer lots, something Chen had complained about to mall management multiple times. During his 8:30 round, he had noticed the Civic was still there but thought nothing of it. Employees sometimes stayed late, met friends, ran errands within the mall. By 11 that night, a detective had been called in. His name was Vincent Morales, 41 years old, a 13-year veteran of Metro's detective division with a specialty in property crimes, but enough experience to handle what was still being treated as a potential runaway or voluntary disappearance. Morales was heavyset with dark hair going gray at the temples, and he approached cases with methodical caution that sometimes frustrated his more impulsive colleagues. He arrived at the mall in an unmarked sedan, dressed in slacks and a short-sleeved dress shirt despite the late hour, and immediately requested that the Honda Civic be processed by crime scene technicians before anyone attempted to open it. While waiting for the techs to arrive, Morales spoke with Stephen Davis, who had driven to the mall and was standing near the police perimeter, his face pale under the parking lot lights. Stephen was 25, tall and lean with sandy blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he kept adjusting nervously. He told Morales everything he knew about Paula's day. She had left their apartment at 1:15 to make it to work by 2. She had seemed normal, maybe a little tired from the heat, but otherwise fine. They had talked that morning about going to see a movie that weekend, something at the Dollar Theater on Flamingo. She had kissed him goodbye, grabbed her purse, and left. That was the last time he had seen her. Morales asked the questions that were standard in these situations, the ones that always felt intrusive but necessary. Were there problems in the marriage? Had Paula seemed depressed, anxious, unhappy? Did she have friends Stephen didn't know about, places she went without telling him? Stephen answered each question with increasing frustration, his voice rising slightly as he insisted that Paula was happy, that their marriage was solid, that she had no reason to disappear voluntarily. She was close with her family, her parents who lived in Henderson, her younger sister who attended UNLV. She had a small circle of friends from work and from the church they attended occasionally in Summerlin. Nothing about Paula's life suggested instability or secrets. The crime scene technicians arrived at 11:35, two specialists who spent the next hour carefully documenting the Honda Civic before using a slim jim to unlock the driver's side door. They photographed the interior from multiple angles, dusted for fingerprints on the door handles and steering wheel, examined the seats and floor mats for anything that might constitute evidence. Inside Paula's purse, they found her wallet containing $63 in cash, her driver's license, with a photo that showed her smiling shyly at the camera, two credit cards she rarely used because she and Stephen preferred to budget with cash, a tube of lipstick, a compact mirror, and a roll of breath mints. Her keys were not in the purse, not in the ignition, not anywhere in the vehicle. Detective Morales stood back and watched the technicians work, his mind already sorting through possibilities. The presence of the purse and cash suggested this was not a robbery. The locked car suggested Paula had secured it herself, intending to return. The missing keys were significant, though their absence could mean many things. Had Paula locked the car and walked away voluntarily, keys in hand? Had someone taken the keys after taking Paula? The vehicle showed no signs of struggle, no forensic evidence that would immediately suggest violence had occurred inside it. Paula Davis had been born in Henderson, Nevada, on March 3, 1969, the first of two daughters to Robert and Carol Davis, a couple who had moved to the Valley in the mid-60s when Las Vegas was still a relatively small city surrounded by vast stretches of empty desert. Robert worked as an electrician, primarily on the Strip, where new casinos seemed to rise every few years, each one larger and more elaborate than the last. Carol was an elementary school teacher at a public school in Henderson, a patient woman who had instilled in both her daughters a sense of responsibility and kindness that everyone who knew Paula remarked upon. Paula had graduated from basic high school in 1987, a decent student who preferred English and art classes to mathematics and science. She had worked part-time at a local grocery store during her senior year, saving money for a car and the vague possibility of college, though she had never been entirely certain what she wanted to study. After graduation, she had taken a full-time position at Mervyn's, where she discovered she enjoyed the work more than she had anticipated. She liked helping customers find the right shade of foundation, liked the quiet pride of making someone feel more confident about their appearance. The pay was modest but steady, and she had met Stephen there in the spring of 1991 when he had come in looking for a gift for his mother's birthday. Their courtship had been conventional and sweet. Stephen worked nearby, managing inventory at a sporting goods store, and they had started meeting for lunch at the mall food court. By summer, they were dating seriously, and by winter, Stephen had proposed in a restaurant overlooking the Strip, the lights of the casinos glittering below them like earthbound stars. They married in July of 1992 in a small ceremony at Carol and Robert's house in Henderson, surrounded by family and a few close friends. The wedding photos showed Paula in a simple white dress, her brown hair styled in soft waves, her smile genuine and unguarded. The apartment they shared on East Tropicana was nothing special, a one-bedroom unit in a complex that housed mostly young couples and single workers. But Paula had made it feel like home with secondhand furniture and plants she tended carefully on the balcony. She talked about starting a family someday, maybe in a few years, when they had saved enough money for a down payment on a house. Stephen wanted children too, though he was less specific about timelines, content to let life unfold at its own pace. They were building something together, a modest but meaningful life in a city that often felt transient and impersonal. On the evening of September 17th, 1992, Paula had worked her usual shift at Mervyn's. Her supervisor, a woman named Margaret Torres, who had managed the cosmetics department for 8 years, would later tell police that Paula had seemed perfectly normal that day. She had helped customers, restocked inventory, chatted pleasantly with coworkers during her break. Margaret remembered Paula mentioning that she was tired, that the heat had been giving her headaches lately, but nothing suggested distress or fear. Paula's shift ended at 8, and Margaret had watched her clock out, wave goodbye, and walk toward the employee exit that led to the parking lot. 2 coworkers had left around the same time, walking out through the same exit within minutes of Paula. Both would be interviewed by police in the coming days. Neither had seen anything unusual in the parking lot. Neither had noticed anyone following Paula or approaching her. The parking lot had been relatively empty by then, most customers having left before the store closed. The September evening had been warm, but not unbearable. The temperature still in the mid-90s, typical for Las Vegas in early autumn. Paula had walked toward her car alone, her purse over her shoulder, apparently without concern or awareness that anything was wrong. Detective Vincent Morales had worked enough cases to know that the first 48 hours were critical, that the window for finding missing persons alive closed rapidly after those initial 2 days. By dawn on September 18th, less than 12 hours after Paula Davis had vanished from the Meadows Mall parking lot, Morales had assembled a small team of investigators and uniformed officers to begin canvassing the area. He was a meticulous man, someone who believed in the power of systematic police work over hunches or dramatic breakthroughs. His colleagues sometimes found him plodding, too cautious in his approach, but Morales had cleared more cases than most detectives in the division, and he did it through patience and attention to detail that others overlooked. The mall opened at 10 that morning, and Morales was there waiting, speaking first with the general manager, a nervous man in his 50s named Douglas Perry, who seemed more concerned about negative publicity than about Paula's disappearance. Morales ignored Perry's attempts to minimize the situation, and instead requested access to security footage from the previous evening. The mall had cameras positioned at major entrances and in some common areas, though the employee parking lot where Paula's car had been found was not covered by any surveillance system. Perry led Morales to a small security office, where grainy black and white footage could be reviewed on a bank of monitors that looked outdated even by 1992 standards. The footage from inside the mall showed Paula at various points during her shift, visible in the background as cameras captured the main walkways and store entrances. Morales watched her move through the cosmetics department at Mervyn's, helping customers, restocking displays, her movements efficient and unremarkable. At 7:58, she appeared near the employee break room, retrieving her purse from a locker. At 8:03, she was visible again near the employee exit, pushing open the door and stepping into the dimness beyond the camera's range. That was the last image of Paula Davis that any recording would capture. Morales spent the rest of that morning interviewing Mervyn's employees, starting with Margaret Torres, the cosmetics department supervisor. Margaret was 42 years old, a longtime employee who had worked retail her entire adult life and had seen dozens of young women come and go through the department. She sat in the mall's administrative office, her hands folded on the table, and told Morales that Paula was one of the best employees she had supervised. Reliable, friendly, good with difficult customers, never late, never called in sick unless absolutely necessary. On September 17th, Paula had worked her complete shift without incident. She had sold perfume to a tourist couple from California, had helped a teenage girl find the right concealer for acne scarring, had reorganized a display that had been disheveled by afternoon shoppers. Margaret said Paula had seemed tired during her break around 5:30, had mentioned having a headache and feeling worn down by the heat. Las Vegas in September was still brutally hot, the temperatures routinely climbing above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, and the mall's air conditioning system struggled to keep up with the demand. But Paula had not seemed distressed or frightened, had not mentioned any problems at home or concerns about anyone bothering her. She had simply seemed like a young woman at the end of a long shift, ready to go home to her husband and relax for the evening. 2 other Mervyn's employees had clocked out around the same time as Paula. Jennifer Wu, a 20-year-old who worked in the women's clothing section, told Morales that she had walked out to the parking lot within 5 minutes of Paula leaving. Jennifer had parked in the customer lot, which was better lit and closer to the main entrance, so she had headed in a different direction once they exited the building. She had not seen Paula after they separated inside. The second employee, Marcus Grant, was a stock worker who had left at 8:05 and had parked his truck in the employee lot relatively close to where Paula's Honda sat. Marcus told Morales that he remembered seeing the blue Civic as he walked to his own vehicle, but he had not seen Paula herself. He had assumed she had already left or was sitting in her car with the engine running, cooling off before the drive home. Morales expanded the investigation to include all mall employees who had been working that evening. Over the next 3 days, he and 2 other detectives interviewed janitors, food court workers, kiosk operators, and security personnel. They showed everyone a photograph of Paula that Stephen had provided, a snapshot taken at a 4th of July barbecue that showed her smiling in a red tank top, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. Most people recognized her vaguely as someone they had seen around the mall, but no one reported seeing her in the parking lot after her shift ended. No one had witnessed anything unusual, no arguments, no suspicious vehicles, no person who seemed to be watching or following her. The crime scene technicians had processed Paula's Honda Civic thoroughly, lifting fingerprints from the steering wheel, door handles, and interior surfaces. Most of the prints matched Paula's own, stored in the system from when she had been fingerprinted for a brief job application at a bank 2 years earlier. A few additional prints were identified as belonging to Stephen, which made sense given that they shared the vehicle. 2 partial prints could not be immediately identified, but they were smudged and incomplete, possibly from a mechanic or car wash employee who had touched the vehicle at some earlier time. There was no blood, no hair or fibers that seemed out of place, no forensic evidence suggesting violence had occurred inside the car. Detective Morales knew he needed to eliminate Stephen Davis as a suspect, a standard procedure that felt cruel but necessary. On September 20th, 2 days after Paula's disappearance, Morales sat down with Stephen in an interview room at Metro's headquarters on East Charleston Boulevard. The room was small and windowless, painted a depressing shade of beige, with a metal table and uncomfortable chairs designed to keep interviews short and uncomfortable. Stephen looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, his hands shaking slightly as he answered Morales' questions for what felt like the 100th time. Morales asked about Stephen's whereabouts on the evening of September 17th. Stephen explained that he had worked his usual shift at the sporting goods store, clocking out at 5:30. He had driven home, stopping at a Taco Bell on Maryland Parkway to pick up dinner for himself, arriving at their apartment by 6:15. He had receipts to prove the purchase, time-stamped at 5:47. He had eaten dinner alone, watched television, worked on some paperwork for his job. He had expected Paula home by 8:30, as always, and had started worrying when she did not arrive. Phone records confirmed that Stephen had called the mall security office at 9:05, had called Metro at 9:47. There was no gap in the timeline that would have allowed him to drive to the mall, do something to his wife, and return home. Morales asked the uncomfortable questions about their marriage, watching Stephen's face for signs of deception or evasion. Were there fights? Financial problems? Affairs? Stephen answered each question with increasing frustration, insisting that their marriage was solid, that they had normal disagreements about small things, but nothing serious. Nothing that would explain Paula's disappearance. They had been discussing buying a house, maybe starting a family in a year or 2. Paula had been happy. Stephen was certain of that, even as he acknowledged that certainty itself felt suspect now that she was gone. The detective asked Stephen to take a polygraph examination, explaining that it was standard procedure, a way to eliminate him from consideration so the investigation could focus elsewhere. Stephen agreed without hesitation, wanting to do anything that might help find Paula. The examination was administered 2 days later by a specialist from Metro's polygraph unit. A series of questions about Stephen's knowledge of Paula's disappearance, his involvement, his truthfulness about the evening's events. The results came back showing no deception. Morales reviewed the findings and made the determination that Stephen Davis was not responsible for his wife's disappearance. He was a husband genuinely terrified for his wife's safety, not a suspect attempting to deflect blame. With Stephen eliminated, Morales turned his attention to other possibilities. He pulled records of registered sex offenders living within a 10-mile radius of the Meadows Mall. In 1992, the registry was less comprehensive than it would become in later decades, but there were still 43 names on the list for Clark County. Morales assigned 2 detectives to begin the tedious process of tracking down each offender, verifying their whereabouts on the evening of September 17th. looking for any connection to Paula or to Mervyn's department store. The work was slow and often frustrating, with offenders who had moved without updating their addresses, who refused to cooperate, who had alibis that needed to be independently verified. None of the registered offenders provided any investigative traction. Some had solid alibis, documented by family members or employers. Others had no connection to the mall or to Paula's life in any discernible way. A few raised suspicions simply by being evasive or uncooperative, but further investigation revealed nothing that would connect them to the case. Morales kept detailed notes on each interview, filing them away in case new information emerged that would make one of these men relevant. But as September turned into October, this avenue of investigation seemed to be leading nowhere. The forensic evidence from the crime scene was limited by the technology available in 1992. The Honda Civic had yielded fingerprints, but nothing definitive. There was no security footage of the parking lot. No witnesses had come forward despite appeals on local news broadcasts and in the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Paula's keys had never been found, not in the parking lot, not in nearby trash receptacles that investigators had searched, not anywhere. The absence of the keys suggested that Paula had locked her car and walked away, either voluntarily or under duress, but it provided no indication of where she had gone or with whom. Morales requested that search and rescue teams conduct a sweep of the area surrounding the Meadows Mall. The mall sat near the intersection of Valley View Boulevard and US Route 95, bordered on one side by commercial development and on another by undeveloped desert land that stretched for miles. If Paula had been abducted and killed, her body might have been disposed of in this harsh landscape where Las Vegas transitioned abruptly from urban sprawl to empty wilderness. Search teams with cadaver dogs spent 3 days combing through the desert terrain, walking in grid patterns, examining ravines and washes where a body might have been hidden. They found nothing. On October 2nd, Paula's case was featured on the local evening news, a 5-minute segment that included interviews with Stephen and Paula's parents, Robert and Carol Davis. Carol sat on the couch in their Henderson home, clutching a framed photograph of Paula, her voice breaking as she begged anyone with information to come forward. Robert stood beside her, his face stoic but his eyes betraying the anguish he was trying to contain. Stephen appeared separately, standing in the parking lot of the Meadows Mall, pointing to the spot where Paula's car had been found, describing how impossible it seemed that someone could simply vanish from such a public place. The news segment generated a flurry of tips that poured into Metro's hotline over the following week. Most were well-intentioned but useless. People reporting sightings of women who resembled Paula in various locations around Las Vegas. One caller claimed to have seen Paula getting into a white pickup truck in the mall parking lot on the evening she disappeared. But further investigation revealed the caller was misremembering the date and was actually describing something she had witnessed weeks earlier. Another tip suggested that Paula had run away to California with a secret boyfriend, but detectives quickly determined this was based on nothing more than the caller's speculation and prejudice about young women who disappeared. One tip seemed more promising initially. A woman named Sandra Mitchell called to report that she had been shopping at the mall on September 17th and had seen a man following a young woman through the parking lot around 8:30 that evening. Sandra described the man as being in his 30s, average height, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. She said she had felt uneasy about the way he was walking behind the woman, maintaining a consistent distance but clearly focused on her. Sandra had been getting into her own car at the time and had not thought much of it until she saw the news coverage of Paula's disappearance. Morales interviewed Sandra extensively, pressing her for details that might help identify the man or confirm that the woman she had seen was actually Paula. Sandra was uncertain about many specifics. She could not say definitively that the woman was Paula, only that she had been young with dark hair and was wearing what might have been a burgundy-colored top. The man's face had been partially obscured by the baseball cap, and Sandra had only glimpsed him for a few seconds before she drove away. She could not describe his vehicle or say which direction he had been heading. Morales worked with a sketch artist to create a composite drawing based on Sandra's description, but the result was frustratingly generic, a face that could have belonged to thousands of men in Las Vegas. The sketch was distributed to local media and posted in businesses throughout the valley, but it generated no useful leads. Either Sandra had witnessed something unrelated to Paula's disappearance, or the man she had seen was skilled at avoiding detection. Morales filed the information away, adding it to the growing case file that now filled an entire box in his office. By mid-October, 4 weeks after Paula's disappearance, the investigation had effectively stalled. Every lead had been pursued and exhausted. Every person in Paula's life had been interviewed and cleared. The forensic evidence was too limited to point in any meaningful direction. Morales continued to work the case alongside his other responsibilities, but he could feel it slipping away from him, settling into that category of unsolved mysteries that haunted detectives and destroyed families. He thought about Paula Davis constantly, about the photograph Stephen had given him that now sat on his desk, about the impossibility of someone vanishing so completely from a mall parking lot on an ordinary September evening. The case remained officially open, but the daily urgency faded as October turned into November and then December. Other crimes demanded attention. Other victims needed justice. Paula's file was transferred to a growing stack of cold cases, investigations that had yielded no arrests and no resolution. Detective Vincent Morales would carry the weight of that failure with him for the rest of his career. Stephen Davis remained in the apartment on East Tropicana Avenue for 6 months after Paula disappeared, unable to bring himself to move even though every corner of the space reminded him of the life they had been building together. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her shampoo bottle sat in the shower. Her coffee mug remained in the cabinet where she had always kept it on the left side of the second shelf. Friends and family urged him to pack up her belongings, to donate them or store them away, arguing that living among these artifacts of absence was unhealthy and preventing him from processing his grief. But Stephen could not bring himself to erase the physical evidence of Paula's existence, could not accept that she was truly gone when no body had been found. No definitive proof offered that she was dead rather than simply missing. By March of 1993, 6 months after Paula's disappearance, Stephen finally moved out of the apartment. He could not afford to maintain it on his single income, and the landlord needed to re-rent the unit. Stephen moved in temporarily with Paula's parents in Henderson, sleeping in what had been Paula's childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters and mementos from her teenage years. Robert and Carol Davis had aged visibly in those 6 months, their faces drawn with the particular grief that comes from not knowing, from existing in a state of perpetual uncertainty about whether their daughter was alive somewhere or had died alone and afraid. Carol had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position, unable to focus on lesson plans and parent conferences when her own child was missing. Robert continued working as an electrician, grateful for the physical labor that exhausted him enough to sleep at night. The first anniversary of Paula's disappearance came and went with a small memorial service at the church in Summerlin that Paula and Stephen had attended occasionally. About 40 people gathered, mostly family and close friends, to pray and remember a young woman whose fate remained unknown. Stephen stood at the front of the chapel and spoke briefly about Paula, his voice breaking as he described her kindness and her dreams for their future together. Carol sobbed openly in the front pew while Robert sat beside her with his arm around her shoulders, his face stone still in the way of men who had learned to internalize their pain. Detective Vincent Morales attended the service, sitting in the back row, feeling the weight of his failure to bring resolution to this family. He had continued to work Paula's case when time allowed, reviewing witness statements and evidence logs, looking for something he might have missed in the initial investigation. But 1993 brought new cases that demanded his attention, fresh crimes with active leads that took precedence over a disappearance that had gone cold. Morales retired from Metro in 2001 after 22 years of service, and Paula Davis's unsolved case remained one of his greatest professional regrets. Stephen eventually moved to a small house in North Las Vegas, remarried in 1998 to a woman named Jennifer whom he had met through friends. The marriage was companionable rather than passionate, built on mutual loneliness and the desire for normalcy after years of grief. They had a daughter in 2000, a child Stephen named Emma, though he never told Jennifer that it had been one of the names he and Paula had discussed during their brief marriage. Stephen did not speak often about his first wife, found it easier to let that part of his life recede into a past that seemed to belong to a different person entirely. But every September 17th he took the day off work, drove to the Meadows Mall parking lot, and stood for a few minutes in the spot where Paula's car had been found 32 years earlier. Robert Davis died in 2007 from a heart attack, 15 years after his daughter's disappearance. Carol always believed the grief had killed him, that the accumulated weight of not knowing had weakened his heart until it simply stopped. She lived alone in Henderson for another decade, maintaining Paula's bedroom exactly as it had been, a shrine to a daughter who had never come home. Carol passed away in 2017 at the age of 76, having spent the final 25 years of her life wondering what had happened to her firstborn child. Las Vegas itself transformed dramatically over the 3 decades following Paula's disappearance. The city that had been home to just over 800,000 people in 1992 grew to nearly 2 million by 2020. Sprawling across the valley floor and consuming the desert that had once bordered neighborhoods and shopping centers. The Meadows Mall remained standing, but declined, as newer shopping destinations drew customers away, its parking lots increasingly empty. Many of its anchor stores shuttered or replaced by discount retailers. The employee parking area where Paula had vanished was repaved multiple times over the years, any trace evidence that might have remained long since buried under fresh asphalt and paint. The technology available to law enforcement evolved in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1992. DNA analysis became increasingly sophisticated, able to extract genetic profiles from smaller and more degraded samples. National databases were established, allowing investigators to compare evidence from unsolved crimes across jurisdictions. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, launched by the FBI in 1998, created unprecedented opportunities to connect perpetrators to crimes committed years or even decades earlier. By the 2010s, genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary tool, using consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through familial relationships, even when the suspects themselves had never been arrested or submitted their DNA to law enforcement. Cold case units began forming in police departments across the country, dedicated teams of investigators who focused exclusively on unsolved crimes, using modern technology to re-examine evidence that had been collected years earlier with far more primitive methods. In 2021, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department established its own cold case unit, assigning 6 detectives to systematically review hundreds of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases dating back to the 1970s. The unit was housed in a building separate from Metro's main headquarters, a nondescript office space filled with file boxes and evidence lockers containing the accumulated mysteries of decades. Detective Sarah Chen joined the cold case unit in January of 2023, drawn to the work by a conviction that advances in forensic science had created an obligation to seek justice for victims whose cases had been abandoned. Not because they were unsolvable, but because the technology to solve them had not yet existed. Chen was 39 years old, the daughter of immigrants from Taiwan who had settled in Las Vegas in the 1980s, and she had spent 15 years working various assignments in Metro before requesting a transfer to cold cases. She was methodical and patient, qualities that served her well in work that required sifting through old reports and re-interviewing witnesses whose memories had faded over time. In March of 2023, Chen began a comprehensive review of unsolved cases from the 1990s, prioritizing disappearances and homicides where biological evidence had been collected but never fully analyzed. Paula Davis's case was among the first files she pulled from storage, a thick folder that contained Detective Morales's original investigation notes, witness statements, crime scene photographs, and evidence logs. Chen read through the materials over the course of several days, constructing a timeline of Paula's last known hours and the investigation that had followed. What caught Chen's attention was a notation in the evidence log about items that had been collected from Paula's Honda Civic, but never subjected to DNA analysis. In 1992, DNA testing was expensive and time-consuming, typically reserved for cases where biological evidence like blood or semen was obviously present. The items collected from Paula's car, a used tissue found in the center console and several hairs retrieved from the driver's seat, had been logged and stored, but never processed, because they seemed unlikely to yield useful results given the technology available at the time. Chen requested that these items be retrieved from the evidence storage facility, a climate-controlled warehouse on the outskirts of Las Vegas, where thousands of boxes containing evidence from old cases sat on industrial shelving. The items from Paula's case were located in a sealed evidence bag, exactly where they had been placed 31 years earlier, untouched and preserved in conditions that had prevented significant degradation. Chen transported the evidence personally to the Forensic Science Division laboratory, where a specialist named Dr. Amanda Reeves examined the materials to determine if modern DNA extraction techniques might be successful. Dr. Reeves was cautiously optimistic. The hairs retrieved from Paula's car included two that still had root tissue attached, which meant they potentially contained nuclear DNA rather than just mitochondrial DNA. Nuclear DNA provided a complete genetic profile that could be compared against databases and used to identify specific individuals, while mitochondrial DNA was less precise and could only narrow results to maternal lineages. Reeves used advanced extraction methods to isolate genetic material from the hair roots, a process that took several weeks and required multiple attempts before yielding a usable sample. The DNA profile that emerged was not Paula's. The genetic material belonged to a male, and when Reeves ran it through CODIS, the national DNA database, she found no match. Whoever had left these hairs in Paula's car had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA submission, had never been convicted of a felony in any jurisdiction that participated in the database. This was disappointing but not unexpected. CODIS contained millions of profiles, but it was far from comprehensive, capturing only a fraction of the population. Detective Chen knew there was another option, one that had only become viable in recent years. Genetic genealogy used DNA profiles to search consumer databases, where people had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, seeking information about their ethnic heritage or family connections. Law enforcement could upload DNA profiles from crime scenes to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, which allowed police searches with proper legal authorization, and use matches to distant relatives to construct family trees that eventually led to suspects. Chen obtained the necessary court orders and worked with Dr. Reeves to upload the male DNA profile to GEDmatch in April of 2024. The system began searching through millions of genetic profiles, looking for matches that indicated familial relationships. Within 48 hours, results began appearing, a cascade of third cousins and fourth cousins whose DNA shared segments with the unknown male from Paula's car. None of these matches were close enough to immediately identify the suspect, but they provided the raw material from which a genetic genealogist could begin constructing a family tree. Detective Sarah Chen had never worked a genetic genealogy case before April of 2024, but she understood the basic principles well enough to know she needed expert assistance. The DNA matches from GEDmatch were just raw data, genetic connections to distant relatives that required skilled interpretation to construct a family tree leading back to the unknown male whose hair had been found in Paula Davis's car 32 years earlier. Chen contacted a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray, a former librarian in her 60s who had become one of the foremost specialists in using DNA to solve cold cases. Ray had worked with law enforcement agencies across the country, helping to identify suspects in decades-old murders and sexual assaults through painstaking genealogical research. Ray agreed to take on Paula's case and began her work in late April, downloading the match data from GEDmatch and analyzing the genetic segments that the unknown male shared with various users in the database. The closest match was a third cousin, a woman in her 50s living in Oregon, who had uploaded her DNA results in 2019 while researching her family history. Ray contacted this woman, explaining that her DNA had appeared in a law enforcement investigation and asking if she would be willing to share her family tree information. The woman agreed, providing Ray with access to her genealogical records that traced her ancestry back several generations. From this starting point, Ray began the meticulous work of constructing a family tree. She worked backward from the third cousin match, identifying common ancestors who had lived in the mid-1800s, then worked forward through each generation, documenting marriages, births, and deaths through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. The process was tedious and time-consuming, requiring access to genealogical databases and historical records from multiple states. Ray worked 10 to 12 hours a day for 3 weeks, building out branches of the family tree, eliminating individuals who could not possibly be the unknown male based on age, gender, or geographic location. By mid-May, Ray had narrowed the possibilities to a specific family lineage. The common ancestors were a couple named Heinrich and Greta Schaefer, who had immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1873, settling initially in Pennsylvania, before their descendants spread across the country over subsequent generations. One branch of the Schaefer family had moved to Nevada in the 1950s, and Ray focused her attention on the male descendants of this branch, who would have been adults in 1992. There were 8 men who fit the general parameters, ranging in age from their late 20s to their early 50s at the time of Paula's disappearance. Detective Chen received Ray's preliminary findings on May 19th and began the process of investigating each of the 8 potential suspects. She pulled criminal records, employment histories, and DMV records for each man, looking for any connection to the Meadows Mall or to Paula Davis herself. 3 of the men could be quickly eliminated because they had not been living in Nevada in 1992. 2 others had been teenagers at the time, which seemed unlikely, though not impossible. That left 3 men who warranted deeper investigation. The first was Ronald Schaefer, who had been 41 years old in 1992 and had worked as a truck driver for a logistics company based in North Las Vegas. Ronald had a minor criminal record, a DUI conviction in 1987, and a misdemeanor assault charge from a bar fight in 1995. Chen interviewed Ronald at his current residence, a mobile home park in Pahrump, and found an obese man in his 70s with severe emphysema who could barely walk from his recliner to the front door. Ronald agreed to provide a DNA sample, which was processed and compared to the profile from Paula's car. The results came back as no match. The second candidate was Martin Schaefer, who had been 33 in 1992 and had worked in construction, primarily on commercial projects throughout the Las Vegas Valley. Martin had moved to Arizona in 2003 and had died in a workplace accident in 2009 when scaffolding collapsed at a construction site in Tucson. Chen contacted Martin's adult daughter, explained the situation as delicately as possible, and requested a DNA sample that could be used to determine if Martin might have been involved in Paula's disappearance. The daughter was shocked but cooperative, providing a cheek swab that was analyzed and compared to the unknown male profile. Martin Schaefer was excluded as a match. That left the third man, whose name was Dennis Schaefer. In 1992, Dennis had been 28 years old, working as a maintenance technician for a property management company that handled commercial buildings throughout Las Vegas. Chen pulled Dennis's employment records and felt her pulse quicken when she discovered that his company had serviced the Meadows Mall, providing routine maintenance for HVAC systems, electrical repairs, and general building upkeep. Dennis would have had legitimate access to the mall, including employee areas and parking lots, as part of his regular work duties. Chen dug deeper into Dennis Schaefer's background. He had been born in Las Vegas in 1964, the youngest of 3 children in a working-class family. His father had worked at the Nevada test site. His mother had been a housewife. Dennis had graduated from Rancho High School in 1982 with unremarkable grades and had bounced between various jobs before finding relatively stable employment with the property management company in 1989. His criminal record was limited to a single arrest in 1988 for trespassing after he was found in the backyard of a residence in an East Las Vegas neighborhood at 2 in the morning. Dennis had claimed he was looking for his dog, and the charges had been dropped when the homeowner declined to prosecute. What made Chen's investigative instincts sharpen was a report filed with Metro in July of 1993, less than a year after Paula's disappearance. A woman named Tracy Holland had complained that Dennis Schaefer, who had been performing maintenance work at the office building where she worked, had been watching her through the windows of her ground-floor workspace. Tracy reported that on multiple occasions, she had looked up from her desk to see Dennis standing outside, staring at her. When she confronted him, he had claimed he was checking the exterior lighting fixtures, but Tracy felt his explanation was inadequate, given how long he had been standing there. The complaint had been documented, but no charges were filed because Dennis's employer confirmed that inspecting exterior lighting was indeed part of his job responsibilities. Chen located Tracy Holland, now in her 50s and living in Henderson, and interviewed her about the 1993 incident. Tracy remembered it clearly, said that Dennis's behavior had frightened her enough that she had requested her employer move her to an interior office. She described Dennis as quiet and awkward, someone who seemed to have difficulty with normal social interactions. Tracy said he never threatened her directly, but something about the way he watched her had felt predatory and wrong. After her complaint, Dennis had been removed from working at that particular building, but Tracy did not know what had happened to him after that. Detective Chen discovered that Dennis Schaefer was still living in Las Vegas, residing in a small house on the far northeast side of the valley near Nellis Air Force Base. He was now 60 years old, unmarried, and worked as a night custodian at a warehouse distribution center. Chen ran his name through every available database, looking for additional criminal history or concerning behavior. Beyond the trespassing arrest and Tracy Holland's complaint, Dennis's record was clean. He had never been arrested for a violent crime, never been accused of assault or harassment again. He paid his bills on time, filed his taxes regularly, and lived a life that appeared unremarkable and solitary. But the genetic genealogy evidence pointed to Dennis Schaefer as a familial match to the DNA found in Paula Davis's car. Chen needed to confirm this with a direct DNA sample, which meant she needed to obtain Dennis's genetic material without alerting him to the investigation. In late May, Chen assigned 2 surveillance officers to monitor Dennis's residence and workplace, documenting his movements and looking for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA through what law enforcement called an abandoned sample. This was legal as long as the item was retrieved from a public location or from trash that Dennis had placed outside for collection. The surveillance team followed Dennis for 5 days, noting that he maintained an extremely regular routine. He left his house each evening at 9:15, drove the same route to the distribution center where he worked from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, stopped at the same convenience store on his way home each day to buy coffee and a breakfast burrito. On May 28th, one of the surveillance officers retrieved a coffee cup that Dennis had thrown into a public trash can outside the convenience store. The cup, still bearing Dennis's lip prints on the rim, was transported to the forensic lab where DNA was extracted from saliva residue. Dr. Amanda Reeves processed the sample and compared it to the unknown male profile from Paula's car. On May 30th, she called Detective Chen with the results. Dennis Schaefer was a definitive match. The DNA from the hair found in Paula Davis's Honda Civic belonged to Dennis Schaefer, placing him in her vehicle at some point, before or around the time of her disappearance in September of 1992. Chen felt the familiar tension of a case finally breaking open, but she knew DNA evidence alone was not sufficient to secure a conviction for murder when no body had been found. She needed to build a comprehensive case that would demonstrate not just that Dennis had been in Paula's car, but that he had been responsible for her disappearance and death. Chen spent the next 2 weeks constructing a timeline of Dennis's activities in September of 1992, pulling employment records that showed he had been scheduled to perform routine maintenance at the Meadows Mall on September 17th, the day Paula vanished. The property management company Dennis had worked for in 1992 was no longer in business, but Chen tracked down the former owner, a man in his 80s named Gerald Benson, who was living in a retirement community in Summerlin. Benson remembered Dennis vaguely as a quiet employee who kept to himself and did adequate work. Benson still had some old business records stored in his garage, and after Chen explained the situation, he agreed to search through them. He found work orders from September of 1992 showing that Dennis had been assigned to inspect and service rooftop HVAC units at the Meadows Mall on the afternoon and evening of September 17th. The work order was time-stamped, indicating Dennis had signed in with mall security at 3:30 in the afternoon. Chen obtained the old security logs from the mall, which had been stored in a records warehouse and had survived despite the decades that had passed. The logs confirmed that Dennis Schaefer had accessed the mall's maintenance areas on September 17th, signing in at 3:32 and signing out at 8:43. Just minutes after Paula had clocked out from her shift at Mervyn's, the timing was significant. Dennis would have been leaving the building through employee areas at the exact time Paula was walking to her car in the employee parking lot. Detective Chen brought her findings to the district attorney's office on June 12th, meeting with senior prosecutor Rebecca Morales, who happened to be the daughter of Vincent Morales, the detective who had originally investigated Paula's disappearance. Rebecca had grown up hearing about her father's unsolved cases, including the young woman who had vanished from the mall parking lot, and she felt a personal investment in seeing the case finally resolved. Rebecca reviewed the evidence Chen had compiled, the DNA match, the employment records placing Dennis at the mall, the history of concerning behavior toward women. She agreed that there was sufficient probable cause to arrest Dennis Schaefer for the murder of Paula Davis. The arrest warrant was issued on June 18th, and Chen coordinated with Metro's SWAT team to execute it early in the morning on June 19th, when Dennis would be returning home from his night shift. The tactical approach was standard procedure for arrests in cold case homicides where the suspect had been living freely for decades and might flee if given warning. At 6:45 on the morning of June 19th, 2024, 8 officers in tactical gear surrounded Dennis Schaefer's house on the northeast side of Las Vegas. Dennis pulled into his driveway at 6:52, driving a faded blue Toyota Corolla that looked as tired as its owner. He was climbing out of the car, a white paper bag from the convenience store in his hand, when officers moved in with weapons drawn, shouting commands that shattered the quiet residential street. Dennis froze, his face registering confusion and then what looked like resignation, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment for 32 years. He was ordered to the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, while officers cleared his house room by room. Detective Chen watched from an unmarked vehicle parked at the end of the block. She had anticipated feeling satisfaction or vindication at this moment, but instead she felt only a kind of weary sadness. Paula Davis was still gone, had been gone for more than 3 decades. The young woman who had walked out of Mervyn's on a September evening in 1992 had never gone home, had never grown old, had never had the chance to become anything more than a victim. Dennis Schaefer's arrest did not change that fundamental tragedy, did not restore what had been taken. It was simply a reckoning that had been delayed for far too long. Dennis Schaefer was transported to Metro's headquarters on East Charleston Boulevard, processed through booking, and placed in an interview room by 8:30 that morning. He sat in the same type of windowless beige room where Stephen Davis had been questioned 32 years earlier, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression blank and unreadable. Detective Sarah Chen had reviewed hundreds of interrogation videos during her career and knew that suspects responded in vastly different ways to arrest, some with rage, others with tears, many with practiced denials that they had rehearsed in their minds for years. Dennis displayed none of these reactions. He simply sat motionless, staring at the metal table, waiting. Chen entered the room at 9:15, accompanied by her partner, Detective Raymond Torres, a veteran investigator who specialized in cold case homicides. They read Dennis his Miranda rights, asked if he understood them, and received a quiet, affirmative response. Chen placed a photograph of Paula Davis on the table between them, the same 4th of July snapshot that had been used in missing person flyers 3 decades earlier. She asked Dennis if he recognized the woman in the photograph. Dennis stared at Paula's image for a long moment before nodding slowly. He said he remembered her from the mall, had seen her working at Mervyn's. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, and Chen had to lean forward to hear him clearly. She asked Dennis to explain how his DNA had ended up in Paula's car. Dennis was silent for nearly a minute, his eyes still fixed on the photograph, before he began speaking in fragments that gradually coalesced into a confession. He said he had noticed Paula months before she disappeared, had watched her during his regular maintenance visits to the mall. He had been attracted to her, had fantasized about talking to her, but had never had the courage to approach her while she was working. On the evening of September 17th, he had finished his work assignments, but had remained in the mall, lingering near the employee exit, waiting to see if Paula would leave alone. When she emerged at 8:05, he had followed her across the parking lot, maintaining distance until she reached her Honda Civic. Dennis said he had approached Paula as she was unlocking her car, had tried to start a conversation, had asked if she remembered him from seeing him around the mall. Paula had been polite but dismissive, had said she needed to get home. Dennis admitted he had become more insistent, had moved closer, had touched her arm when she tried to open her car door. Paula had pulled away sharply, had told him to leave her alone, had threatened to call security. Dennis said something inside him had snapped in that moment, a rage he could not fully explain even now. He had grabbed Paula, had covered her mouth when she tried to scream, had forced her into the passenger seat of her own car. Chen asked what happened next, where Dennis had taken Paula. His story became vaguer, evasive. He claimed he had driven Paula north into the desert, that there had been a struggle, that she had died accidentally, though he could not or would not specify how. He refused to provide specific locations, saying only that he had buried her in the desert somewhere beyond Henderson, in terrain that had likely been developed over in the decades since. He said he had returned to the mall parking lot later that night, had wiped down Paula's car to remove obvious fingerprints, though apparently not thoroughly enough to eliminate his DNA, had locked it, and walked back to where he had left his own vehicle parked nearby. The news of Dennis Schaefer's arrest spread through Las Vegas with remarkable speed. dominating local television broadcasts and social media by the afternoon of June 19th. The case had every element that captured public attention. A decades-old mystery finally solved. A young woman whose life had been stolen. A killer who had hidden in plain sight for 32 years. Local news stations interrupted regular programming to report that an arrest had been made in the 1992 disappearance of Paula Davis, a case that many longtime Las Vegas residents still remembered despite the passage of time. What shocked the community most profoundly was learning that Dennis Schaefer had remained in Las Vegas throughout the decades following Paula's murder, had continued working in maintenance and custodial positions, had lived an outwardly unremarkable life while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. Neighbors in the northeast Las Vegas neighborhood, where Dennis had lived for the past 15 years, told reporters they had barely known him, that he kept to himself and never caused problems. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Patricia Ruiz, said she had occasionally seen Dennis leaving for his night shift at the warehouse, but had never exchanged more than brief greetings with him. The idea that a murderer had been living quietly among them for years disturbed residents who had believed their neighborhood was safe and familiar. The warehouse where Dennis had worked as a night custodian for the past decade issued a statement expressing shock and cooperating fully with the investigation. Co-workers described Dennis as solitary and uncommunicative, someone who performed his duties adequately but never socialized or revealed anything about his personal life. The property management company that had employed Dennis in 1992 no longer existed, but former employees who could be located expressed similar sentiments. Dennis had been forgettable, a quiet presence who had attracted no particular notice or concern. Stephen Davis received notification of the arrest through a phone call from Detective Sarah Chen at 7:30 on the morning of June 19th, minutes after Dennis had been taken into custody. Stephen was 62 years old now, living in the same North Las Vegas house he had purchased in the late 90s, his second wife, Jennifer, having passed away from cancer in 2021. His daughter Emma was 24, working as a teacher in Reno, unaware that her father had been married before, or that she had been named after a child her parents had hoped to have. Stephen had rarely spoken about Paula over the decades, had allowed that chapter of his life to become something he referenced only in his own mind, on quiet evenings, when memories surfaced unbidden. Chen's phone call shattered that careful compartmentalization. Stephen listened as the detective explained that a man named Dennis Schaefer had been arrested for Paula's murder, that DNA evidence had definitively placed him at the scene, that he had confessed to killing her, though the location of her body remained unknown. Stephen thanked Chen in a voice that sounded hollow even to himself, hung up the phone, and sat motionless at his kitchen table for over an hour, trying to process information that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. A vigil was organized for the evening of June 21st at the Meadows Mall parking lot, the site where Paula had last been seen alive 32 years earlier. More than 200 people gathered as the sun set behind the Spring Mountains, many of them strangers who had never known Paula, but felt compelled to honor her memory and acknowledge the tragedy that had finally found resolution. Stephen attended, standing near the spot where Paula's car had been found in 1992, surrounded by flickering candles held by people whose faces he did not recognize. A local pastor spoke about justice delayed but not denied, about the persistence of truth, about a young woman whose life had mattered and would be remembered. Dennis Schaefer remains in custody awaiting trial, charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping in the death of Paula Davis. His trial date has been set for March of 2025, more than 32 years after Paula disappeared from a mall parking lot on an ordinary September evening. Prosecutors are seeking a life sentence without the possibility of parole, arguing that Dennis's decades of freedom while Paula's family suffered constitutes an aggravating factor that demands the maximum penalty allowable under law. Paula's body has not been recovered despite extensive searches in the desert areas north of Henderson, where Dennis vaguely indicated he had buried her. The landscape has changed dramatically since 1992, housing developments and commercial properties now covering terrain that was once empty wilderness. Stephen Davis has said that while he would like to give Paula a proper burial, the arrest itself has provided a measure of closure that seemed impossible for most of his adult life. The case represents a broader truth about cold case investigations in the era of advanced forensic science. That evidence preserved with care can yield justice even after decades of silence, that families who never stopped hoping can finally receive answers, and that those who believe they have escaped accountability may discover that time does not erase guilt, only delays its reckoning. Detective Sarah Chen stood in the evidence storage warehouse in August of 2024, 2 months after Dennis Schaefer's arrest. She reviewed Paula Davis's evidence box one final time before trial, the cardboard container labeled with case number 92-4731. Inside lay Paula's purse with $63 still intact, her driver's license showing a shy smile, credit cards she rarely used, and a restaurant receipt from 1 week before she vanished. The genetic genealogy breakthrough that identified Dennis represented a revolution in cold case investigation. In the months since his arrest, Chen had received calls from detectives across the country seeking guidance on similar techniques. The technology was creating a reckoning for criminals who had believed themselves safe after decades of silence. Stephen Davis would testify at trial about his marriage to Paula and the 32 years her absence had shaped his life. Her younger sister, now 51 and working as a nurse, had wept when learning of the arrest, never truly believing this day would come. The trial would begin in March of 2025. Regardless of outcome, one truth remained certain: Paula Davis had not been forgotten. Her case proved that truth had its own timeline, that accountability could not be escaped indefinitely, and that even after 3 decades of silence, justice could still speak for a life taken far too soon.